Hi everyone, it's Angela from Cloudfetti, and today I'm sharing tips, tricks and techniques on how to properly bake polymer clay. So to start out, polymer clay is a clay made of PVC or polyvinyl chloride. It's a type of plastic that has a lot of other ingredients mixed in, and it needs to be baked in an oven to harden it or cure it. And you can buy polymer clay at art and craft stores and also online. And there are endless ways that you can use it, so from making your own charms, jewellery, mixed media projects, sculptures, home decor and more. There are different types of clay that aren't polymer or bakeable, like modelling clay, air dry clay, cold porcelain, Play-Doh, or any other type of kids' clay. Baking these types of clays will actually melt or burn, as most aren't meant to be placed in the oven, so you want to make sure to check what kind of clay that you're using before starting. Some brands out there say that it's polymer clay, but it's actually an air dry type with a soft foamy texture. If there's no baking temperature or instructions on the packaging, it's one that you can't bake. There are many polymer clay brands, and I found no single one is best. They're all different. Mostly brands differ in strength, so you want to choose the best clay for your project. I've made a little list of strongest to weakest brands that I've tried, and although some clays are weaker than others, even if they're baked correctly, they're not necessarily bad, they just have their own uses. For example, Sculpey 3 is a super fragile clay, and it's best not used as a base for a creation, but just as decorations on top of stronger brands. I've used it as main parts in charms, and even after baking properly, it still broke after some time. If you have bought some clay that's on the weaker side, you can strengthen it by mixing it with some stronger brands like Primo, Fimo, etc. You just want to mix in a 2:1 ratio, with the stronger clay being the 2. It just won't be as strong as if it was 100% of the more premium brand. As for the brands that I use, I mainly use Fimo, Primo and a little bit of Sculpey 3 because these are most available to me. But whatever brand you're using, properly baking is the most important part of creating with polymer clay. If it's not done well, it's going to be brittle and most likely break. I found that you can't properly or safely cure polymer clay in the sun, a traditional microwave, boiling water, or with a heat tool. It just doesn't reach the required temperature or time. If you don't have an oven to cure your polymer clay, use air dry clay or any other type that doesn't require heat to set. For baking polymer clay, you can use different ovens like a home oven. Most houses have one and they can bake large creations. They do use a little bit more energy when baking, but you can bake food in the same oven as polymer clay, just not at the same time, so it is convenient. Just be careful when cooling clay inside. You may forget or not realize and preheat the oven on high for making food, which will burn and ruin your project. I actually prefer to keep my clay and food separate, so I use a smaller oven just for crafts. Good options are toaster ovens, OGTs, convection microwaves with an oven setting, turkey roasters or halogen ovens. For those on a budget or beginners trying out clay for the first time, check out your local charity shop or online marketplace where they sell for cheaper. I've used a toaster oven. It's small and lightweight, so it preheats quicker, cleans easy after each use, and is good for small batches instead of heating up a large home oven. It uses up less energy and you can set the dial once and leave it as is for the next time that you bake. It does take up some space, so portability is a huge plus. You could take it outside or in the garage if needed. I did find temperature consistency wasn't that great. It did often spike in heat since the heating elements are much closer together, sometimes leading to darkened or burnt clay. So I did put tiles in and on top of the oven to hold heat. Using this oven, there was a little bit of a sour smell when baking polymer clay, so I always opened up a window for fresh air. It was also a little bit too small, so I couldn't make larger creations if I wanted to. I've since switched from a small toaster oven, which was 9 litres in size, to an 18-litre benchtop convection oven. This has been my favourite oven to use. It's compact enough to bake small and large creations. On the convection or turbo setting, it blows the hot air around and heats evenly so it doesn't create hot spots or heat spikes. It also doesn't smell weird, but I do still leave the window open just in case. So with the ovens that are available to you, they each will be different, so do your own tests in various ovens to see which works best for you. To bake your clay, you can use a non-shiny tile, a metal baking sheet or tray, or a ceramic dish. For a good cure, temperature is super important, so use a separate oven thermometer to test the true temperature inside your oven. As a guard against the top heating element, you'll need a tent, so a disposable aluminium tray is great. You'll also need to protect your clay against the baking surface, so baking or parchment paper works well. And an oven glove helps to put the clay into the oven too. Every oven is different. You'll find that most temperature dials are not accurate and they bake much hotter or cooler than what's set. My oven is set to an internal temperature of 130 degrees Celsius on my separate thermometer, but on the actual dial it reads about 115 degrees. As you can see, it's way off, so you want to know how your oven behaves before baking your clay. First, preheat the oven and baking surface for about 20 minutes with the thermometer inside, just so that it comes up to the temperature on the clay packaging. If you're using a tile inside your oven, it takes longer to heat up. Then watch the thermometer through the door without any clay inside to see what temperature it reaches, if it holds heat, if and when there are any heat spikes, etc. Then just adjust the settings to get the right temperature on the thermometer, like if you need a tile to hold in the heat, or set the dial lower or higher to reach the temperature on the packaging, etc. Then finally bake some test clay in various thicknesses for different amounts of time, making sure that your baking surface is as close to the center of your oven as possible for even baking. And then once they've cooled down completely, test the strength by flexing the clay and not bending it. Strongly baked polymer clay is flexible since it's made of vinyl plastic, and weakly baked clay will snap in two. If you're not happy with things that you've already baked, don't be afraid to reuse them in future projects. You can grate them or chop them with a craft knife or blade and incorporate them into raw clay, like for chocolate chip cookies. Polymer clay does not need to be baked immediately. It can be left for months at a time until you're ready to continue, but it needs to be reconditioned after a while, which just means working the clay so that it becomes soft and pliable. When you're not working with clay, place it onto some glass covered with a container to protect it from dust. Some containers will melt and stick to polymer clay, but I found that ones marked with the number 5 polypropylene sign don't react, so that they're safe to use. You also want to avoid placing clay onto any kind of paper, or it's going to leach out and soak up the oils, making the clay really dry and brittle. Polymer clay needs to bake for long enough at a high enough temperature for the ingredients inside it to fuse together. Most clays bake at 130 degrees Celsius or 275 Fahrenheit for 30 minutes per quarter inch or 6 millimeters of thickness. For best results, you want to bake longer than the recommended time that's on the packaging. It's not like cooking food, so longer baking will not burn your clay if it's at the correct temperature. If the oven temperature is correct and the clay is tented, you can bake for hours at a time with no problems. It also won't shrink or expand in the oven, so you can make things as big or as small as you'd like. I like to bake my pieces for 1 hour minimum, regardless of the size, for a really strong cure. The time it takes to bake your creation depends on the depth of the raw polymer clay. For large or thick pieces, it might bake for a few hours. You want to use a ruler to measure the distance from edge to edge at the thickest part and bake accordingly. On each package, temperatures may be in Celsius or Fahrenheit. You want to use the temperature used in your country. The US uses Fahrenheit, while most other countries use Celsius. If you're unsure which one you use, you could just do a quick search to find out. Polymer clay brands have different baking times and temperatures. Mostly I've just found that these are general guidelines for a good cure and not the best. But for me, I've found that the Sculpey Primo brand instructions are most reliable, which is 130 degrees Celsius or 275 Fahrenheit for 30 minutes for every quarter inch or 6 millimeters of thickness. So I made up a little chart of the clays that I've used and their baking times and temperatures, and you can see how different they are. You can combine different clay brands even if the baking temperatures differ. They can be touching on the one creation or mixed together to form new colours. Generally, you want to bake at the higher temperature and time of the clays used. I mostly combine Primo, Fimo and Sculpey 3 in my charms, with Primo having the highest temperature and time, so I use these instructions as a guide, baking for an hour minimum at 130 degrees Celsius or 275 degrees Fahrenheit, and it doesn't affect the other clays. On the back of the Fimo package, it says not to exceed 130 degrees Celsius, so it's absolutely fine to bake together. Here are some of the little charms that I've made and the different types of clay used for each one. The only brand that I would bake alone is Kato because the baking temperature is a lot higher than others at 150 degrees Celsius or 300 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're making something with Kato and Fimo, for example, I'd bake them separately and not as a combined colour. So if I was making this cat in a teacup, with the cup being Kato and the cat being Fimo, I'd bake the teacup at the higher temperature and then attach on the cat with liquid clay and then just do a second bake at the lower temperature. I don't recommend baking at super high temperatures for shorter amounts of time. Polymer clay starts to burn at higher temperatures. I also wouldn't bake at lower temperatures for longer. Reducing or increasing the heat won't reach the recommended temperature and will underbake your project, causing breakage. Underbaked polymer clay looks exactly like fully baked clay, but it breaks or crumbles easily. People worry that their clay will burn or overbake, so they underbake by a fair bit. You can actually never overbake your clay. At the right temperature, using a separate oven thermometer, you can bake for hours. It won't burn if it goes 1 degree above the recommended temperature, only if the oven is as hot as about 190 degrees Celsius or 375 Fahrenheit. If you've underbaked your clay, you can bake it again, this time at the correct time and temperature, since clay can be baked multiple times. It just won't be as strong as if it was baked long enough the first time. You can pre-bake your clay for about 10 to 15 minutes, which hardens it, but it doesn't cure it completely. It makes the clay easier to cut. I pre-baked this pizza as a whole circle, and then I cut out a slice, added toppings on top, and rebaked for a full hour. Raw clay sticks to raw clay, so there's usually no need to add any liquid clay to stick things together. It can be added for extra strength, however it's not really necessary. Adding baked clay to raw does require liquid clay to act as a glue and must be baked to fully adhere pieces together. Polymer clay can be baked multiple times at different stages of putting your project together. If you're not pre-baking, it's best to bake the stages for the full amount of time, add to it, and repeat for extra strength. Findings or metal pieces can be baked in with clay. For example, you can add them in, bake, and use an adhesive to reattach later. You can also embed and bake them into the clay so that it's secure, leaving no need for reattaching after baking. Glass can be baked, however some things like magnets can't, which can actually demagnetize while baking, so use the magnet to make a little dimple in the clay, and then you just want to bake the clay on its own. And then when it's cooled down completely, you can attach the magnet back on with an adhesive. Most plastics can't be baked, so for example, if you're using plastic eyes, you want to switch to glass beads instead. For projects that are large or require lots of clay, you can use foil or wire for extra structure and then build more clay onto it so that your project becomes lightweight, saving on clay. You can also use wire to hold pieces in place. You also don't want to be using styrofoam as an armature or base. It just doesn't work well and melts polymer clay. Polymer clay can be baked in silicone molds, but not all types can be heated. To test it, just snip off a little piece of the mold and bake it. You can also just place the molds with clay inside in the freezer, then remove the clay and bake the clay on its own that way. I would not recommend making dishes or utensils that you plan to eat or drink from fully out of polymer clay, even if they're sealed with glazes. Instead, you want to make elements on them in places that don't directly touch the mouth. You also want to hand wash the items so that the clay doesn't get wet and avoid placing them in a dishwasher. You just want to be safe because there just might be some cracks in the clay where little beasties can grow. Adding powders like glitter, mica, chalk pastel or eyeshadow must be added to raw clay, otherwise it just won't stick, and then just bake as normal and it will stick to the clay. Baking round or odd-shaped objects on a flat surface may cause flat spots, so baking on a bed of cornstarch or baking soda protects the shape, prevents flat spots and burning, and also stops things rolling around. In some countries, these powders are named differently. Cornstarch is corn flour and baking soda is bicarb soda. You don't want to confuse it with baking powder, which goes slightly jelly-like when baked due to the rice flour inside. The powders will actually leach raw clay if left in contact for too long, making the clay weak, so put the clay in the oven immediately after placing it on the corn flour. After baking, use a paintbrush to brush off the excess, and then use a toothbrush to scrub it under running water to remove any baked-in residue if you need to. To bake my charms, I preheat my oven, baking tray, baking paper and foil tent to 130 degrees Celsius or 275 Fahrenheit, and I do this for about 20 minutes on the turbo convection setting, and I make sure that it reaches temperature on my separate thermometer. It reaches a very high heat and then crawls back down to the correct temperature. I then remove the tray and place my charm onto the baking paper and cover it with the foil tent. Then place the entire thing onto the center rack for even heating. I then wait until the temperature comes back up and then bake for a full hour. After the timer goes off, I let everything cool down completely with the door closed for a few hours or even overnight. Polymer clay is most fragile when warm, so don't handle it as soon as the oven finishes baking. If you cool the clay down too fast, it can cause a sudden change in temperature, causing cracks, so leave the clay to cool down completely in the oven with the door closed. Some people like to quench or plunge their clay into cold water right after baking to speed up the cooling process, but I've tried this and it developed fine cracks and it kind of fell apart, so I wouldn't recommend this method. Fully baked clay looks the same as half-baked. It hardens, darkens slightly, and has a flat finish without the stickiness of raw polymer clay. For thin, flat pieces, don't bend, but just slightly flex the clay. If it's bendy, it's perfect. If it snaps in two, it's not fully baked yet. After baking, you'll sometimes see tiny moon shapes on the surface. This is called plaquing or mooning, which are gases that form in the clay while baking. It's mostly visible in translucent clay, but still happens in solid or opaque colours. You just can't see it because it has a lot more pigment or colour added to it. Cracks may be from clay expanding while baking if it's not conditioned properly, or if you remove it from the oven too quickly after baking. You also want to avoid using water on your polymer clay creations. Most brands aren't compatible with it and will lead to cracking when baking. Sometimes you might see that your clay has darkened a bit if baked uncovered. I found that it's caused by longer baking times, but it doesn't mean that it's burnt. To stop this from happening, tent your clay with a foil cover so that it protects it from the heat from the top of the oven. You don't want to reduce your oven's temperature or you'll end up with weak projects that will break easily. Shiny spots on the bottom of the clay are caused by baking directly on a glossy tile or kitchen foil. This is easily prevented by using baking paper or a non-shiny tile as your baking surface. If your clay burns, it usually means that your oven is way too hot. You want to make sure to stand by your oven, never leaving it unattended, and making sure to check your thermometer frequently. Burning clay usually starts to smoke and smell really bad. If it happens, make sure to turn your oven off and bring your oven tray outside so that it has time to air. Air bubbles form because air gets trapped in the clay during conditioning. Before baking, I pierce it with a sharp tool, push the air out with my finger, and then smooth it flat with a cotton tip or Q-tip dipped in nail polish remover or isopropyl alcohol. If there's any after baking, I sand them with sandpaper, but to avoid them in the first place, I take care conditioning before baking. For sanding, I use sandpaper which can be used wet or dry. It's cheap and easily found at hardware stores in a range of grits. In general, you want to start with a lower number and then work up to a higher one, resulting in a smooth surface. Polymer clay is waterproof once baked, so you don't need to glaze your clay. You can leave it flat or matte. You can also add a glaze to it to make it nice and shiny, or give the creation a little bit more protection from wear and tear. These need to be added after the clay is baked, but just be sure that it's the last thing that you do, because once it's been brushed on, some glazes can't be rebaked and should not go back in the oven. There are a lot of art mediums like some brands of acrylic paint or glazes that just aren't compatible with raw or baked polymer clay, and they'll always stay sticky no matter how long you leave them to dry for. So always test on a hidden section of the project first before fully covering it. And that's all for this tutorial. I hope that this video has been helpful to you. If you have any more questions, write them down in the comments section below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. If you like this video, give it a big thumbs up and subscribe for more. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye!